of the Marine Corps in 1959. I was in charge, because Dad was out of the country briefly, of the editorial policy, fighting Ross Barnett like crazy, endorsing everything seen. And in Washington County, we won 7 out of 9 major endorsements. Said, "Whee, if I got power, this is wonderful." But I also knew about the reaction to it. So I carried a gun on my body and in my car and at the desk and in the house from 59 until 64. And if you recall, there was a fairly hot period back there. And we had Ole Miss, the shorthand, of course, for federal troops having to be used to get one person into college. We had the assassination of Medgar Evers. We had the Freedom Summer deaths. And while in retrospect, it was the silliest possible posturing for me to be carrying a gun around, at the time it sounded very, very normal to me and very necessary. My kid brother killed himself with a pistol, and I put guns up in 64. But we survived, and you asked that question. One, because I think a lot of people thought we were too dangerous to actually physically do something to. And second, because Greenville prided itself on being different, and was, to the degree that, thanks to part of the Percy tradition and other things, and partly to heavy editorial work by Dad, saw itself as not being a place in which you brought down the brick house on anybody who was out of step, but also because we were a very, very good community newspaper, and also finally because some of the leading citizens of that community might not have been integrationists, indeed weren't, but were from ethnic and religious heritages which understood that a lot of those crazy white segs weren't that fond of Jews and Lebanese and Chinese and Irish Catholics and Italians. And that, in a way, the Hodding Carters stood between them and the next target, which had been the target in the 1920s Klan. Not so much blacks then, but all the non-Anglo-Saxon whites. And I think that helped us, because a lot of those people were the substantial merchants of Greenville. I mean, the major home-owned stores were largely in the hands of folks who themselves did not think they were inside the magic circle of white supremacy, the white, at least by the common definition. We had a lot of friends. It was in some ways very hard. We were under constant boycott from 1955 until 1969 or 70, as I said, but not in Greenville. And we survived. We had a get-together of Democrat Times reporters last year, and they came from all over, and they had different things to say about what it had been like, though they all seemed to have enjoyed it. Every one of them said, "I was never paid that badly, ever, except at the Delta Democrat Times." And there was a simple reason for it. We had a cash flow which virtually was inverted, January, February, March, and into April every year. And the largest amount of money we made during the boycott years before taxes was $80,000. And we hired 50 people, and anybody who knows anything about cash flow, anybody who knows anything about enterprise knows that was not enough money to open the doors, except you did. So it was very tough, very tough. But we were accepted as community members in that town, and we ran a paper which damn well said that this is the town that matters, and I think we survived in large part. Also, it was impossible to resist my mother, who was both beautiful and smart, and my father, when he was not being belligerent, was extremely gregarious, which is a nice way to say he loved parties, and was out there amongst folk all over the place, and he was hard to resist also. But we were the whipping boys for quite some time by a lot of white Mississippi. What finally changed us being relevant is that it suddenly turned out no white newspaper boy in Greenville, Mississippi had a single thing to do with the racial revolution that was underway. Even the most idiotic of the segregationists had to look up and say, "Hey, black man speaking for himself. Hodding Carter's not directing it. Matter of fact, he's not even near the front of the parade." And the pressure began to go away. That was my two-sentence answer to his one-sentence question. Right?
There's a story I heard you tell once a long time ago about a night you thought that they might really be coming for you. Why don't you tell that story?
Well, actually, this is relevant to why I quit carrying guns, if you want to know the truth. We had had a series of editorials at the time when Ross decided that he was single-handedly going to reverse the verdict of the Civil War and keep one black man out of Ole Miss. And the final editorial on the morning that finally the marshals got him here on the campus and before the overnight wildness that led to the troops. That Sunday morning I wrote an editorial which said, it is now past time for the federal government to bring the governor of Mississippi before the federal courts on the charge of sedition. He has now been at deliberate war with the Constitution and the government of the United States, and he needs to be in the penitentiary. At which point we lost 10% of our circulation, by mid-morning, and tons of threats, obviously. It gets really hot that night because of the events over here. And while a number of boys I know well happened to be in the mob, particularly from South Washington County, happened to be in that mob, there were still enough of them left in Washington County who were indicating that they were coming to get us, that we were with the feds and the mongrelizers, and they were going to come get us. So an old friend of mine, a restaurant owner, and a former high school mate who was an off-duty sheriff, lay outside our house all night with guns, waiting for all these guys who were claiming that they were going to come, and we lived just outside the city limits. Nothing happened. In the middle of the night, my father, who is writer in residence by then down at Tulane, called up and said, "Is everything all right, son?" I said, "Absolutely fine, Dad." And my mother got on the phone and said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, Chief of Police has somebody around the newspaper. We're lying out here with guns." My dad had not hung up on the other line. He said, "Blankety blank, 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 we're coming now." He grabs my mother, he grabs my uncle, he grabs my newly married brother. They load up the car with guns and they drive through the night, and they get in about 5 in the morning to our house to find the brave defenders of our clan and newspaper fast asleep. Nothing had happened. Sunrise had come and nothing had happened. So that night we're exhausted. I go in, I write the obligatory editorial. It is time to bind up the wounds. Don't say anything about sending Ross Barnett to jail, nothing like that. We go to bed, wake up the next morning. Cross had been burned up in front of the house, all neatly covered with stuff to make it burn. And we weren't there. 3 days later, the then sheriff, the last time we had a political ally who was sheriff, called up and said, "We got him." I said, "Got who?" He said, "We got the kids who burned the cross." And I said, "How was that?" Well, it turned out one of those idiots had used his underpants with a name label carefully put on it by his mama to use to start the fire, and it hadn't fully burned out. Now, what's the point of that story? We would have killed him. We were so afraid. We were so certain that the mob was coming that the moment that car pulled into the driveway and somebody got out, and I just say this for a fact, we would have killed him. We would have shot him on the spot the minute they broke the property line. And I thought about that a lot when I decided about whether or not carrying a gun was a great idea. It was not the last incident, but it was the last thing that in any way would have called for heroic actions, like shooting people. There was one problem, I will say this in passing, family in Greenville, Vern and Frankie Keating, writers, photographers, what have you, famous folks, and they have a son, now over in Atlanta as an orthopod. He was working for a Delta farm supply company, and he came to see me one day and says, "You need to know that the guy who works with me, DeLay Beckwith, wants to know every detail of the outline of your house out there in the country. Where the roads go, how do you get into the back?" At which point, for about 2 years, we kept all the blinds pulled in the back of the house because I could see that skulking killer, making his way around. And there was a lot of that kind of conversation, but it never came through. It never, and I don't really understand it, but it never did.
DeLay Beckwith, of course, being
the assassin, the murderer of Medgar Evers. And it's about a crazy and outhouse rat that's ever walked on this earth. in almost every respect. But anyway.
You know, when I was a Democrat Times reporter, there were some uncomfortable moments, but I was never confronted with any violence. But there were Democrat Times reporters who did run into violence, weren't there?
Yeah. One of the better guys that worked there, except for you, of course, on the paper was a man named Foster Davis, who was, in fact, a Yankee. He had served after college and now was on his way to a graduate journalism degree at Columbia on some fellowship, but came down to work as a summer intern for us in '64, the Freedom Summer of 1964. And all hell was breaking loose. The kids had vanished, who had, of course, been murdered. And freedom houses were being torched all over the Delta, and people were being beaten up, and people were being disappeared. Foster went off to cover some burning over in Indianola. About 3 hours later, he comes back into the newsroom, blood all over his shirt, banged up in the face, looking like just a whipped dog. I said, "What the hell's the matter with you?" He says, "Well, walking down the main street there in Indianola, 3 punks walk up to me and say, 'You one of them civil rights workers?'" He said, No, I'm a reporter for the Democrat Times," at which point they stomped the hell out of him. So he comes in. He says, "Can we fight back?" And I said, "You not only can fight back, you can carry a gun if you want to." The point of the story is just this. Foster Davis was about as tough a man as I ever knew in my life. He whipped more people, more often, for the next 4 years that he was working for us than half the Delta had ever seen whipped. He loved being challenged because it gave him an excuse to get back one more time at the guys he had let whip him because he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. But that was at the height of the heat. I mean, you know, by the time you're there, they certainly weren't loving us, but they weren't, you know, stomping reporters or anything like that.